Welcome to the first Let's Make a Synthesizer tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Okay, this is a sound which it sounds complex, but it's actually deceptively simple. Before I get into it, I'll just point out that I did get a little bit carried away, and while I was setting up this tutorial, I made about 4 different versions of this sound. These are included with the program just as preset instruments that you can load up and play around with. So let's just quickly go through these. The second one is pretty much the same thing, but it has sort of a high frequency component and a sub bass. So if you have a subwoofer, you should be able to feel this one. The next one has a little bit more of a complex mixing structure. The fourth one is pretty much the same thing, but the equalization is just a little bit different. It's a subtle difference, but it is noticeable. And then for the last one, I just kind of went for that smooth house bass kind of sound, and I just took the vowel filtering right out of it, so it sounds more like a nice typical bass to underlie a 4-on-the-floor track. So, right, you can load up these presets, play around with them, but for now, let's go back to this guy and let's show you how to make it. So the first thing that we're going to do is go to the File menu and hit New. Okay. And alright, we've just got the main output here to get started with. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is switch over to module mode, and this is where we're going to be constructing the synthesizer. The next thing that you should do is go to this text box in the top left corner and switch it to the number 1. Now what this means is that when you create a new module, it is going to have the same amount of voices that are displayed in this text box. Alright, so since we have it set to 1, we're going to be making modules that can play 1 note at a time. They're basically monophonic, and if you're just getting started out with AudioGL, it is better to just stick with monophonic synthesizers for a little while. It's a little bit easier to connect them together and to just connect everything to everything. And in later tutorials, we'll start moving into polyphony and an explanation of what sort of connections AudioGL will let you do. Alright, but for this one, we're sticking to a monophonic synthesizer. So the module that I've just created here is a sequencer. You can think of a sequencer as being the central brain for a synthesizer. This is the module which says when a note is going to be starting, when a note is finishing, and what pitch that note is going to be at. This is also the module which is responsible for MIDI input from a keyboard. Alright, so if I hit my keyboard, you can see that it's getting activated and then turning back off. And there's also an editor built into it. Alright, this is where you would put in a score of notes and eventually turn that into a track at some time. Okay, but for now we're just focusing on generating the synthesizer, not upon sequencing. The next thing that I would want to make is an oscillator. Okay, now this would be a module which I would call a sound generator. Whereas the sequencer focuses on just having the idea of a note, a sound generator takes that idea and turns it into sound. So you can see that there is a green connection coming out of here and coming into here. This is a sequencer connection. Okay, so what it's transmitting is just note on, note off, and pitch values between the two modules. Alright, now let me show you a little trick here. If you just want to listen to this oscillator without actually connecting it to an output, what you can do is you can switch to parameter mode. Just click on any of the parameters here to bring up the pop-up menu. And in the pop-up menu, hit the S or solo button. Okay, so now we can hear the oscillator, even though it isn't actually connected to an output. This is because we're soloing it, we're just listening to this one module. Alright. So let's explain how this works. The sequencer just sends the note data to the oscillator, and the oscillator generates a tone at the pitch value that's been provided to it. Now, you can modify this tone by selecting different waveforms. So right now we're working with a triangle waveform, but we also have a sawtooth, or a square wave, a pulse wave, sine, white noise, and there is even a wavetable, which is programmable. Okay, so if I'm going too fast for you here, there is an online manual which does explain this in more detail, but all that you really need to know to get started is that each waveform has its own specific purpose. You can use a sine wave to generate a kick drum. You can use white noise to make snare drums, and you can use sawtooths or square waves to make big, earth-shattering analog basses and that kind of stuff. Alright, so these are all just basic building blocks which can be used to make something that sounds a lot bigger. There are other ways to control the oscillator, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about right now, but the basic ones are that you can control the octave. There's also semitones. Okay, and if I need to explain any of that stuff, then you shouldn't be watching this tutorial, you should be studying music theory. Alright, so let's move on to the next thing. First of all, just to tell you how to finish up that little trick that I showed you, turn off the S button, because right now the oscillator is being soloed, which means that it's going to be the only thing that we can hear right now. So by turning this button off, I am disabling all of the solos across the entire project, and this is going to set AudioGL back into its normal state. Okay, now the next thing that I'm going to create is a filter. Now what a filter does is it takes a signal, such as a signal coming from an oscillator, and it either removes or boosts frequencies that are flowing through it. Okay, so let's use this trick again and solo out the filter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove frequencies, just the high frequencies from this signal. Okay, so now we can hear that all that is coming through is just the lower frequencies, the subharmonics. Now if I crank this parameter up, we get something a little bit different. Okay, this is something that's referred to as resonance. What that means is that it's actually taking the cutoff frequency, which is the frequency where the filter decides like any frequencies higher than this are going to be removed from the signal, and any frequencies that are lower than the cutoff frequency are allowed to pass through the filter. What resonance does is it actually boosts the signal right at that cutoff frequency. Okay, this is something which it almost seems to be arbitrary. I don't know who actually thought of this idea, but it's something that has become completely central to the design of electronic music. Like, everybody uses this sound, every synthesizer has it, and it's something that you probably want to get familiar with. Now, there are other types of filters inside of here. This one that we were just using is called a low-pass filter, but we also have a high-pass filter, which I would activate just by moving the slider all the way up. And this one would allow you to remove low frequencies while letting the high frequencies pass through. And in a similar vein, we have something called a band-pass filter. And what this does is it removes both the high and the low frequency signals and just lets a small band pass through the filter. Okay, now there is still more to filters than that, but I think that's enough for now. Again, we will disengage the solo. Or you know what, I'll leave it engaged for a second and we'll focus on something completely different. Let's say that you wanted to have this crosshair move back and forth automatically without you having to do it by hand. What you would use to do this is modulation. Now, to provide modulation in AudioGL, you want to use a module called an envelope. This is the purple one. So let's drag one of those into here. And just like the oscillator, the envelope module, it does need to be triggered by the central brain of the synthesizer, which, as I already mentioned, is the sequencer. So we are going to use the sequencer to trigger the envelope. You'll see that whenever I hit a note, it's getting turned on and off. Okay. Alright, now we want to move over to modulation mode. This is where we're going to be taking the modulation provided by the envelope and using it to make parameters move around by themselves. So I will click on this red handle and connect it to the pitch handle from the filter. Alright, and by pitch what I mean is basically the pitch value of the cutoff frequency. So this is something that we can actually modulate. And you can already hear that it sounds a bit different. Because you can see this curve here. You can see it a little bit better right here. That parameter is being moved by that curve as I play the note. Now there isn't just one curve inside of the envelope, it actually has 8 curves inside of it. And if you move this parameter up and down, you can try different types of modulation just on the fly. So let's take a listen to this. Okay, and another thing that I can do is I can add and remove, or I can modify the amount of modulation that's being added to this parameter just by moving this amplitude slider up and down. So let's listen to that. Okay, so if it's right in the middle, then there's going to be no modulation applied. If it's below the middle, there's going to be negative modulation, sort of the opposite applied. And if it's cranked all the way up, then we're getting full modulation. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and disable the solo. And we are going to go to the next stage and make another module. So the next thing I'm going to make is an equalizer module. But strangely enough, I'm not actually going to use it. I'm just going to plug it into here. So you might be wondering, why would I do that? Well, when you're building synthesizers in a program like this, it generally comes down to you getting into a track that you're working on and realizing that you need to make some adjustments to how your synthesizer sounds. This is why it makes a lot of sense to add extra modules to your synthesizers as you're making them. Even if you aren't going to use those modules, there's a good chance that you're going to need to use them down the line. So this is something that you'll probably learn over the course of time. Basically with AudioGL, after working with it for a month or so, you get a feel for what sorts of modules you really need in a synthesizer when you're making it. So I know intuitively that this equalizer should be here, but I'm not actually going to use it just yet. Alright, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another module. And this is going to be a bit crusher. So here we go. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a dummy module. And this is going to be like the final output of the synthesizer. Alright, this is a module which doesn't really do anything, it just lets the audio flow right through it. It does have a volume control on it, but for the most part it's just an extra module, which, exactly like the equalizer, it doesn't really seem to have any purpose. But that isn't exactly true. Again, later on, when I'm working on a song, I'm going to think that I want to add more modules to the end of this synthesizer. And I'm going to delete this connection, and I'm going to drop all of that stuff into there. Okay? So, again, it's a very useful design decision. When you're making synthesizers, you should make a separate main output because later on you'll understand why. Okay, now I thought that this was a bit crusher, but I actually made the wrong module here. So let's remedy that situation. See, even I make mistakes. And finally, let's take the main output and connect it to the main output equalizer, which is going out to the speakers. Okay, so I don't need to use the solo technique anymore. We're actually sending this new synthesizer out to the main output for the project. Okay, so let's take a listen to it now. Alright, surprise, surprise, it sounds exactly the same. But this is where the magic happens. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just turn down this sample divider a little bit and it should transform into something else. Okay, now you might wonder what exactly is happening here, and the answer is that it's a little bit too complicated to explain in this tutorial, but in short, there are certain frequency components being generated by this filter and this oscillator, and what I'm doing is I am lowering the sample rate of the signal. Essentially, I'm kind of just lowering the sound quality altogether. This causes the frequency components being sent out from here to be modified to the point where they begin to resemble frequencies present in the human voice, basically just vowels. So how does that work? Well, the answer is that it's not really important, but basically electronic music producers figure these things out just by experimenting with a lot of stuff and eventually coming across really cool sounds like this one. And then I guess the next logical step is that they think I should write a dubstep track about this. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the tutorial, but let's just do a couple extra things here. First of all, I can make the sound a little bit more full by adding a second oscillator to it. So let's go ahead and do that. Just like the first oscillator, I'm going to connect it up so that it's controlled by the sequencer, and then I'm going to add it into this filter. Now what I can do is I can program this one so that it is at a different octave than the first oscillator. Okay, so let's switch this one back down to a square wave. And I think that this might actually sound a little bit better if I didn't have so much modulation on it. Okay, now the next thing that I'm automatically thinking is that to make this sound better, what I want to do is I want to delete this connection and start doing some frequency splitting down here, which is out of the scope of this particular tutorial, but frequency splitting is something that's kind of important. A lot of producers use it nowadays. Essentially, you would take the signal, you would break it up into separate pieces, and then you would mix all of those pieces differently, and the end result is that it would sound really cool. Okay? I'll give you a quick example of that before I wrap this up. This is a sound which I already showed you. And in this situation, what I actually have is basically the same structure that we're looking at here, but after the bit crusher, I have 3 different filters which are splitting this up into different frequency ranges. Okay? And that's how I made it sound more like this. Okay, this is something that's already beginning to sound a little bit more professional, something that you would actually hear in a dubstep track. Okay? So I think that's a good start. I'm going to be making probably a lot of videos like this where I describe different synthesis techniques. So I don't know, leave a comment, tell me what kind of sounds you want me to make, and I'll look into doing it. And thanks for watching.